חידה באמצע הדרך, מאת דוקטור אלון גלעדי. נגד ובעד קאנט. על הדת בגבולות האמונה הלוגית בלבד. על הצו המוסרי ועל הפרחתו.
Immanuel Kant is the Enlightenment successor of the Rambam. He and no other, just as Nietzsche is the Enlightenment successor of Spinoza. He and no other. Kant is the rational, faithful successor of the Rambam, and not of Thomas Aquinas, for example. This since within the framework of the attempt of connection between the religion to the reason, and the designing of the fundamental principles of the rational religion, he rejects entirely the possibility of the existence of the mysticism and the rational requiring to the secret and to the definition of the God situated beyond our recognition. One should not be surprised that Kant thinks in contrast to Spinoza, and similarly to the Rambam, that one should not interpret the writings of faith wherever they are in the manner of literal peshat, but only and solely in the manner of homily, darash, standing in one line with the a priori reason, which he identifies erroneously with the categorical moral imperative. And indeed, the first serious attempt after the Rambam to connect again between the faith to the reason was done by Kant, while distinguishing between the rational scientific field, the speculative in his language, as an a posteriori, experimental, observation on the objects of the reality by means of the perception of the senses upon an a priori intellectual substrate, and between the practical rational moral field as a derivative of an a priori rational law preceding the perception of the senses. The failure of this attempt from the moral aspect dragged after it severe and erroneous conclusions also regarding the connection between the morality and the science according to Hegel and Marx, or to the absence of a rational connection between the science to the morality and the faith as the conclusion of Nietzsche from this side, and of Leibowitz from that side. To the failure of this important attempt, and to the correction of the conclusions that were concluded from it, I will require in this chapter, as a new-old continuation to the faithful logical path of the Rambam. As remembered, the formal Leibowitz declared himself as one who is not a humanist, and even is not a man of universal morality, which is not to be found, according to his claim, in complete contrast to the position of Kant. On the other hand, the faith of truth, according to Leibowitz, is for its own sake, lishma, and it is characterized as the ultimate purpose of man in the fulfillment of 613 commandments according to the halakha, which is not rational from an exemplary perspective, and this without any clear rational explanation why. By this, the formal Leibowitz left the question of the faith and the morality together as a riddle requiring a rational solution, or, as the system of the formal Nietzsche, to absolute rejection. I determine at the beginning of this complex and simple chapter that there is not to be found a categorical moral imperative, and one should not accept faith for its own sake without a rational explanation. Morality and faith without a rational exemplary explanation are at the end of the day necessarily morality and faith that are not for their own sake, but for the sake of a subjective taste, whatever its real source may be. And indeed, compared to Leibowitz, Kant seeks to determine that there exists indeed a universal morality, being designed by means of a categorical rational imperative, which is a priori as itself and applicable according to the will of the good man or the non-will of the wicked. Moreover, according to Kant, there exists also a faith of truth, the religion of God upon the earth, whose earthly practical, incomplete foundations, given to recognition, are revealed also they, or come to expression by means of that same a priori obligation, that same categorical rational imperative. To the rational is there exist two types of reason according to Kant. The one a priori, preliminary, primary, pure, and it is the practical reason or the morality which is not given to any experience, situated in us as ourselves, and it is an expression of supreme freedom, of pure will, which are not dependent on a thing from the material reality, but from them is derived the worthy way of action. On the other hand, there exists in the rational Isler is the scientific, theoretical, speculative reason, as in his language, from which are derived, learned the laws of the reality, except for what is beyond the recognition, the transcendent, and are defined the objects of the reality, and this by means of experience, which is, in practice, the perception of the senses of the reality upon the a priori intellectual substrate of the categorical intellectual concepts. The existence of God, according to Kant, is not learned from the theoretical reason, as it is a field that is beyond it, and therefore, from its perspective, God is not known, and is not known, does not exist necessarily, and does not exist. The existence of the God, according to Kant, is learned specifically from the pure practical reason, whose rational conditions are, necessarily, immortality, freedom, and the existence of God, who treasures within his essence the supreme good, meaning the pure, a priori moral imperative from which is derived also the religion of God upon the earth, and every interpretation in its matter. 1. Our eyes see immediately that with the falling of the categorical imperative, and without its correction, behold, according to the system of Kant, we stand before the absence of an objective morality, and perhaps even before the absence of the God, from the perspective of the absence of a rational ability for the proof of his existence, as the conclusion of the formal Nietzsche. Our eyes see also that from the point of view of the essential Leibowitz, whoever seeks to require to the existence or to the non-existence of a universal morality as an opening for the proof of the existence of a universal religion, or, on the other hand, to a rational connection between the science, the morality, and the religion, matters to which the formal Leibowitz objects, must require to the thought of Kant, and from its refutation, require to the morality, and separately, or not separately, to the worthy, faithful religion. The essential reason for this is that there is nothing new without old, there is no future without past, there is no thought in the paths of the truth, without requiring to the thought that preceded it, and without a rational requiring to its foundations. The attempt of Kant to show the a priori rational existence of a universal morality and the existence of a rational divine religion upon the earth, which Leibowitz rejects entirely, both in point of departure and as essence, is the central rational foundation attempt known to us after Plato, Aristotle, and the Rambam in the revealing of the moral and the religious, practical universal dimension together. As much as there exists a difficulty in the understanding of the morality and the faith, which exist in man as themselves, without a doubt, there exists a necessity to try and understand them as much as possible, and to outline in an exemplary manner the way to the paths of the truth, the moral and the faithful together. In contrast to the formal Leibowitz and to the essential Kant, I claim here that the morality and the religion are learned in the paths of the truth in an objective manner. The morality and the religion are learned from experience upon an a priori rational substrate, and not in an a priori manner. They are learned in a rational manner, similar in its fundamental essence to the scientific learning, but more extensive and supreme than it. They are not situated in the full reach of man, just as the full scientific truth is forever not in the reach of man, and even more so. Due to the significant difficulty to reveal them, stemming from their rational complexity, they are seen in the eyes of the observers as a product of moral intuition or divine revelation, and are examined in practice, in the thought of the observers, in the paths of the faithful logical truth. On the other hand, they are seen on their face in the eyes of the faithful or logical observers separately, as subjective, or at least sometimes as mystical, concerning the severe conclusions to here or to there, due to errors and false imaginations, derived from this type of observation, which has with it, in an essential manner, nothing and half a thing. The understanding of the modern thought, regarding the way in which we perceive ourselves and the world around us, received a highly important lever in the thought of Kant, constituting, among other things, also a first great Enlightenment attempt after the Spinozian fracture, to bridge in a rational manner between the world of the is to that which is beyond it, as a rational necessity. This thought, which recognized the is given to the research of the reason, and that which is beyond it, and to the recognition, which is not given to the research of the reason, saw to give to our reference toward them rational rules from within a deep exemplary way. Therefore, the deep observation of Kant constitutes a suitable floor, from within its refutation, for a modern discussion rooted in the achievements and in the errors of our predecessors, regarding the worthy rational reference to the morality and to the faith together. In this chapter, I will not require to the analysis and confrontation against the critique of the pure, theoretical, scientific reason of Kant, but I will accept as an assumption its essentials, as one general perception, except for a few sparse remarks. The object of the discussion in this chapter will be specifically the critique of the practical, moral reason of Kant, and a critique regarding his views about the religion within the limits of the reason alone, also in relation to the thought of the formal Leibowitz. For the purpose of the discussion before us, I will assume that the claim of Kant for the existence of synthetic a priori judgments as a substrate for the sensory perception and its processing into laws and into descriptions of the objects is correct. Or, in other words, we design, or discover, more precisely, the laws of the is by means of the perception of the is, upon and by means of an intellectual substrate existing in us a priori, without a need for any experiment, and I am not required to the question whether the discovery of this substrate itself is done by means of a thought experiment upon an a priori substrate preliminary to it, and therefore it too is given to refutation. An examination in the thought of Leibowitz raises that in practice, his view is in agreement with the view of Kant regarding the matter of the critique of the speculative reason. According to the system of Leibowitz, the world of nature is forced upon us, and it is an objective truth perceived by our recognition. This is also the approach of Kant. On the other hand, the formal Leibowitz objects in an explicit, decisive, and justified manner to the view of Kant regarding the existence of an objective morality, coming to expression by means of a moral, rational imperative that there is an obligation to fulfill. If Kant thinks that from within our thought alone, we draw the rules of our worthy custom in an irrefutable, subjective, logical manner, behold, Leibowitz negates this entirely. To his taste, the morality is a volitional subjective decision, and there is not before us a decision of action of the subjective will in relation to the objective, a priori morality expressing the pure will, a concept that it seems Leibowitz negates entirely, and rightly so. The morality, according to Leibowitz, is devoid of any forced or a priori and/or universal generality. But this objection of Leibowitz to the existence of a categorical/a priori moral imperative does not lead, unfortunately, to the correction of Kant in the practical moral aspect, and to the theoretical and faithful conclusions resulting from such a correction, but to an erroneous giving up, lifting of hands. The absence of requiring to the correction of the categorical imperative affects also the religious rational dimension in the thought of Leibowitz, due to the erroneous implications in the moral and the religious dimension together of the critique of the pure reason. Alongside the claim of the formal Leibowitz to the absence of a universal moral imperative, stands his claim according to which there exists a faith for its own sake, without any connection to the rational intellectual morality, which action according to it is done in a volitional subjective manner which creates it. Before us is a claim of faith for its own sake, without any rational explanation, how much more so objective? And behold, the contradiction in this claim stems from its very essence, as I clarified above, both from its conceptual aspects and from its methodological aspects. As much as we walk or seek to walk in the paths of the moral and the faithful recognition, we must examine whether those who required to these worlds in a rational manner, which has in it a rational method, erred, and whether it is possible to conclude moral, rational, and faithful logical conclusions from these errors of theirs. First and foremost, stands positioned before us, in the rational moral and the faithful logical context, the brilliant and erroneous theory of Kant. The conceptual practical source of the erroneous reference of Leibowitz to Kant is in the absence of a logical analysis as pure as possible and as refuting as possible of the thought of Kant, and the concluding of conclusions from it. This error characterizes both the formal Leibowitz and the best of the thought after Kant, between that which acted according to the substrate of the categorical imperative and between that which negated it entirely, and I will explain now my words. According to the formal Leibowitz, there is not to be found an absolute moral truth, or an absolute moral value, and this similarly, and at the same time differently, from the required conclusion of Nietzsche for the refutation of the categorical imperative. A man is committed to his truth, according to his own decision, when its volitional dimension is not given to recognition and to explanation, but to every man as a subject, there can be a moral value, according to the value that he decides in his word. Accordingly, you cannot claim, in a logical manner, regarding the correctness of one value against another value. Hence, by the way, it also results that the decision between contradicting values is not rational, but forceful. This view is in a Kantian translation, the negation of the moral categorical imperative, designing a universal morality, which there is an obligation to fulfill, and all this without a systematic analysis, and in practice, without an analysis at all of this claimed imperative. In practice, the formal Leibowitz thinks that Kant errs in his claim, according to which there exists a universal, absolute, and binding moral truth, learned from within the reason and from within it alone. But he does not require to the foundations of the view of Kant, and to the conclusions reflected from the refutation of these foundations, as I will do here and now. The negation of the categorical imperative is revealed from within the definition of this imperative, and it seems that this matter was understood already by Kant himself. According to this a priori rule, act so that the guiding rule of your will could forever be valid also as a principle of a general legislation. An examination of this claim reveals that there is not to be found a practical rule which can be turned a priori into a general rule which is beyond the private subjective will. It is not possible to learn a thing and a half a thing from the definition of the categorical imperative regarding the preference, and how much more so the absoluteness of such or another moral value or custom over its fellow, from within the examination of the will, and without an addition of an objective ultimate purpose to this rule, which cannot be added to it from the very definition of the imperative. Kant is well aware of this claim, and the definition of his moral imperative seeks to require to what he calls pure will, which is beyond the subjective will, which is the supreme freedom since it is not dependent on the senses, but it is imprinted in us in an a priori, rational manner. In this is hidden his fundamental failure, and this since the morality is not determined at all by the human will, whereas the pure, a priori, divine will is not given at all to the recognition of man, beyond the very recognition of its existence. In practice, as can be seen in the critique of practical reason, due to his fundamental errors in the definition of the morality and in its foundations, Kant penetrates inadvertently to the transcendent field, which is beyond the theoretical recognition, and by this he falls to that same error that he himself saw to explain and to demand the avoidance from it in the critique of pure reason. At the beginning of the things, and in relation to the founding sentence itself of the categorical moral imperative, I will note that the claim for the discovery of a universal moral rule without an external experiment to the thought, from the perspective of checking a logical contradiction in the transition from a practical rule to a general rule, is erroneous in an immediate logical manner. Let us assume that the practical rule is the non-fulfillment of a promise, and I want to know if it is possible to turn it into a general rule. According to the claim of Kant, it is not possible to will in a general, universal moral rule, according to which one should not fulfill a promise, since this rule contradicts the very definition of the promise as something that one must fulfill. This claim is refuted from its foundation, since in practice it treasures within it a clear, subjective, preliminary assumption regarding every promise that does not stand as itself, but in relation to something. In fact, from a subjective perspective, it can be claimed that that same practical rule is the general moral rule, since there is no case identical to its fellow. Meaning, in a case absolutely identical to the case to which the practical rule was required, one must act according to it, since it constitutes for this identical matter a general rule. But behold, there is not regarding the world such an identical case. Moreover, from the very examination of whether I can will logically that the practical rule be a general rule, results a built-in subjective will, according to which I define the observation of the subjective will to the relation between the practical rule to the general rule, a matter matching the formal Leibowitz and contradicting Kant. Also, the attempts of correction for the clear failure in the categorical imperative in which Kant recognized in the form of an action of pure will, which is beyond the subjective, the ability to will, or the existence of an ultimate purpose to the object of the moral action, man, nature, matter, etc., within the framework of the general rule, cannot avail to the categorical imperative for similar reasons. The reason for this is their leaning of the attempts of correction upon the bases of the categorical imperative, negating every a posteriori examination of the objects of the morality derived from the imperative expressing the pure will, the rational will, which is not dependent on the senses. In practice, Kant failed in his goal meaning, the extraction of the subjective and the experience from the definition of the universal objective moral rule. This failure stems, among other things, both due to the absence of a worthy requiring to the definition of the morality, both due to the erroneous leaning upon the issue of the will, both due to the absence of a correct requiring to the definition of the subject and the object of the moral rule, and both due to the erroneous relation between the private to the general. Therefore, at the beginning of our walking toward the correction of the categorical imperative, we must define from an exemplary perspective what is morality. Afterwards, for the purpose of the discovery of the universal moral rule, one must examine the exemplary essence of the moral subject and the object meaning, their exemplary ultimate purpose resulting from their essence and learned after a theoretical observation, both in a basic manner and in a specific manner, and then to require, in an exemplary manner, to the question of the relation between them, according to the exemplary definition of the morality. Meaning, in contrast to Kant, it is not possible to dress upon the objects of the moral research the claimed pure a priori will, which is not known and cannot be known to man at all. And therefore, every attempt to require to it is erroneous from its foundation, as I showed in relation to the rule proposed by Kant. Moreover, in relation to his specific definition of the categorical rule of Kant, it is not possible to apply the a priori rule, the claimed pure will, upon the ultimate purpose of its objects, determined necessarily in a theoretical manner, as then necessarily this rule becomes experimental, and this within the framework of an a priori basis erroneous from its foundation. One must check the specific ultimate purpose of the subject of the moral action, including his natural, a priori, general ultimate purpose as an individual and as many, and his specific, a posteriori ultimate purpose as an individual and as many, in relation to the object of the moral examination, and this in disconnection from the private subjective will, and how much more so a pure, absolute free will, which is not given to the knowledge of man. Furthermore, one must require to the correction of the issue of the relation between the private domain, reshut hayahid, and the public domain, reshut harabim, which is not a logical relation of mere feasibility of the moral rule according to its linguistic meaning, but a relation of logical balance between the individual's domain and the public's domain, resulting from the very a priori definition of the morality as itself, as I will clarify below. The error of Kant regarding the categorical imperative is thus learned from a logical analysis of the foundations of the categorical rule, as distinguished from its results. And it is not to be solved without this analysis, just as one should not require to the proof of any argument without a critical requiring to its foundations. The correction of the categorical imperative is in practice the conclusion arising and ascending from the analysis of the relation between the practical rule to the general rule, and in their definition, in a modern correcting manner, combining the Aristotelian teleological logical thought and the Kantian rational logical thought together, upon their errors and their great achievements. The universal moral rule is not revealed by means of a logical transition of will from the practical rule to the general rule, and the relation between them is not an a priori, internal logical pure relation. On the contrary, the relation between the practical rule and the general rule is a relation of objective logical balance learned in an a posteriori manner upon an a priori rational moral substrate. Kant's desire to reach an objectification of the morality in an a priori rational manner without experience for the purpose of bypassing the subjective volitional aspects of the morality, constituted, unfortunately, a goal in his important analysis requiring correction, and not a result of a pure rational analysis of the issue of the morality. This failure of outlining a goal for the purpose of determining the moral rule was diagnosed inadvertently by Nietzsche in his remark regarding the intention of the thinker, putting the goal of the research in advance, and is separated necessarily from a progress of truth within its framework. Nietzsche erred when he cancelled the categorical imperative on the background of the claimed intention of Kant, and this without a fundamental analysis of the imperative itself, since, as said regarding the author's intention, there is no real importance, even when it is recorded in an explicit manner, for what can be analyzed in a rational manner is the text and the text alone, and not the thought of its authors. The basic reason for the failure of the categorical imperative is rooted before everything in the definition of the morality, which is missing in the analysis of Kant. There is no doubt that morality is not what we do in practice, which is apparently dependent on our free, relative will, but specifically, what is worthy that we do. It seems that this matter is acceptable to Kant in a general manner, and constitutes for him the basis of the wickedness of man by his nature, since there exists a built-in gap between the Kantian morality of duty, designed in a pure intellectual manner, and the subjective will, including the objects of the practical reason, meaning the faculty for desire defined as good, and the faculty for aversion defined as evil, given apparently to the whims of the matter and the senses. What is worthy that we do in a moral manner is necessarily dependent a relation between us to a certain thing, situated in our world and hence also in our recognition, to be distinguished from what is worthy that we do in a faithful manner, and to this I will refer later. That same relation between us to the object of the morality is not a relation learned from the practical rule in a volitional logical manner, definitional linguistic internal, according to what we can will, since the will is not at all the basis of the relation which we seek to design as a universal law, but the moral subject, object, and relation. The practical rule and the general rule of Kant are not the moral subject and also not the moral object, but their derivatives, the conclusion resulting from the examination of the moral relation. When I seek to know whether to fulfill a promise, I do not check the logical internal essence of the promise, but its essence in relation to me, and in relation to the entire world of the is. In other words, the moral subject is the general a priori private domain, reshut ha-yahid, public domain, reshut ha-rabim, and relation from a moral perspective. The moral object is the practical rule examined in a moral manner in relation to the specific private domain and public domain, meaning regarding the matter of its suitability to the private domain and to the public domain together. The moral rule in relation to a specific matter is learned from a balance between the general and specific private domain to the general and specific public domain, and not from the logical definition of the promise, and this without connection to the issue of the will and its feasibility. This relation of balance is obligated as worthy only from the very definition of the individual's domain and the public's domain, which teaches about a built-in aspiration for the existence of the individual and the collective of individuals together, and in a more complete manner, for the existence of the individual and the essence of the is entirely. On the other hand, the logical definition of the categorical imperative does not teach at all on what is worthy that be done, since it is not required at all to the foundations of the individual's domain and the public's domain, and to the worthy relation between them as an a priori essence examined in an experimental manner, upon their essence perceived by means of the senses in relation to a specific matter. A logical definition of an a priori moral imperative, without requiring to the balance between the private and public domain, leads necessarily to an absurdity according to which there exist infinite moral rules, since there exist infinite different testing situations, and, on the other hand, there exists only one moral rule correct for the individual's domain. In other words, according to the erroneous categorical imperative, from the volitional logical point of view of the individual, every way of action that will benefit him is correct in a general manner regarding him as an individual and regarding every other individual in an identical situation. Moreover, from the volitional logical point of view of the individual, in relation to the essence of the promise, behold every different context of another specific promise, meaning, regarding another matter, obligates another moral rule. And behold in practice there is no situation that is identical to its fellow. And more so, there is not and cannot be a definition of will logical or pure will. For behold, pure free will exists as clarified above, only and solely in the field that is not given to man, which is beyond his recognition. The internal failure in the definition of the categorical imperative was understood apparently, but erroneously, by Hegel and also by his different successor, Marx, who sought to show the existence of a moral truth derived from an a priori historical/material process, and this in disconnection from the particular free will of Rousseau and the objective will mentioned also in the arguments of Kant. The proposals of Hegel and Marx required in practice to the identity between the Kantian moral process to the theoretical process in their proposal for a dialectic of rational spirit, or matter, derived from a rational a priori idea without separation between the fields, and by this they failed. They failed, among other things, in the absence of a distinction between the worthy, ought, to the existing, is, and in an essential, systematic rational thought ignorance of the dimension of rational faith. The error of Hegel and Marx stemmed, among other things, from the absence of a direct analysis and refutation of the failures of the categorical imperative, from the ignorance of the issue of the relative and absolute free will, and from particular assumptions regarding the essence of the relation between the private domain to the public domain. Whereas the essence of the relation must be learned in an experimental, objective manner, regarding each and every case for itself upon a general a priori substrate, and not from a priori and controversial particular assumptions regarding the essence and ultimate purpose of the relation between the individual to the collective, between the individual to the essence of the is, and how much more so his status before the inclusive existence. In Hegel, it is a matter of a dialectical, rational immanence in the world of the is, according to the mutual transition from a defined, private subjective sphere to a defined, general, universal sphere, according to the idea of the spirit of the age, Zeitgeist, in a process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis translated to the world of human history, in which it includes, in an objective manner, the subjective private and the supreme from it, embodied in a moral objective manner in the state. As far as it concerns the faithful aspect, behold, according to Hegel, there exists an identity between the faith and the philosophy from the perspective of their object, which is the absolute truth. It turns out that the common object to the religion and to the philosophy is the truth as it is for itself and for its own sake, the God in the measure that he exists, as he is for himself and for his own sake, and man in his relation to him. In the religions, men created their thoughts regarding the highest values, and from this perspective, the religions are the highest work of the reason. And behold, the object of the philosophy is that same object itself, the general reason existing as it is for itself and for its own sake, the absolute essence. My emphases, A.G. It is agreed in the opinion of Hegel that both fields are identical from the perspective of the content and the goal, and are distinguished from one another only in form, to be distinguished from the science, which is the absolute opposite, in his opinion, for it deals with the earthly reality and not with the infinite. The philosophy deals with the truth, and more precisely, with God. It is a constant worship of God. Its content and the content of the religion are one, which is to say, only their forms are distinguished from one another, and sometimes it only seems that they are opposite to one another, to the end of the opposition. At first glance, they are not distinguished from one another, and only afterwards it turns out that they are hostile to one another. From here, Hegel moves to the description of the formal differences between the philosophy and the religion, including those between the reason and the revelation, and reaches the conclusion that there exists a built-in historical development of the formal opposition that is between the religion to the philosophy. The thinking is revealed first in the field of the objects of the religion, and afterwards beside these objects, in a way that the opposition still does not reach our consciousness. But when later the thinking overcomes and leans on itself, behold, it declares itself as opposing the form of the religion. It does not want to recognize in the religion its own concept, and it seeks nothing but itself. And in days to come, this opposition goes and intensifies when there appear philosophers denying explicitly the gods, and afterwards reaches the third stage. The course of development of this opposition in history is therefore this. The thinking is revealed first in the fields of the religion, situated in this traditional content, meaning it is unfree for itself. In the second stage, the thinking overcomes, understands itself as based on itself, as leaning on its form, and reveals a hostile position to this form, since it does not find itself in the other form. In the third stage, it recognizes itself also as this form, and reaches the ability to understand this other as a moment of itself. Hegel's fantastic analysis is problematic in its basis, since it is based on assumptions regarding an a priori historical rational process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis disconnected from the will, which cannot be truly established regarding the course of the relation between the faith and the philosophy, to be distinguished from a search after the relation itself as itself, the unending search after the truth in all fields of the reason, the science, the philosophy, and the faith. This error of Hegel leads him at the end of the day to an erroneous immanence in the world of the is, when he identifies the supreme, unified thought in the opposition between absolute, objective spirit, the spirit of the age, the God, which is for itself, to the subjective thought. Again, before us is an a priori matter of requiring to what is beyond the field of recognition necessarily, and to a historical process in the world of the is derived from that same assumption, which has not and cannot have even supports in that dry, rational thought, requiring exemplary proofs and a distinction between the world of the is and what is necessarily beyond it and beyond the recognition of the reason. The content of the religion is therefore God in the aspect of spirit. If we ask therefore, what is God? Behold, we must answer, God is the general, absolute, essential spirit. From the perspective of the relation of the spirit of man to this spirit, it is important that we have a clear concept of the essence of the spirit. In what are religion and philosophy distinguished? The common to both of them is what exists as it is for itself and for its own sake, meaning the general, absolute spirit. This is spirit, but at one and the same time it contains within it the nature. It is it itself and also the inclusion of nature within itself. The spirit is not identical with the nature in the superficial sense as understood in chemistry, but it is identical with it within itself, meaning consolidated in it into an unity with itself. The spirit is identical with the nature in a way that the nature, meaning its negative side, which is the real thing, is placed solely as something ideal. This is the idealism of the spirit. The generality of the spirit, to which philosophy and religion refer, is an absolute and not an external generality, a generality penetrating in all, present in all. Beyond the basic error of Hegel regarding the identity between the God to the nature, and how much more so in the practical realization of the God, one should note his understanding according to which the goal of the philosophy is to unite with the faith as the aspiration of both of them is the truth. This conclusion of Hegel is a supreme thought that is worthy to be led to the paths of the faithful logical truth, for if not so, it will be a source for views of falsehood, as it was not once in the past, and also, following Hegel, when the cancellation of that immanent dialecticity against that defined and clearly undefined divine spirit led to another erroneous immanence, to dialectical materialism. If so, to the religion and to the philosophy, a common content, and the religion is not distinguished from the philosophy except in form, and the matter of the philosophy is nothing but that the form of the concept be completed until it can grasp the content of the religion. The philosophy is not opposite to the religion, it grasps it. But for the absolute idea, for the absolute spirit, it is of necessity that the form of the religion exist, for the religion is the form of the consciousness of the truth to all humans. The way to the design of the religion is 1. Sensory perception, 2. an infusion into it of the form of the general, meaning reflection, thinking, even if abstract thinking, which still has in it a great measure of externality. Afterwards, man approaches the concrete design of the thoughts and conducts speculations on the true. The true, in its true form, penetrates to his consciousness. In the history of the philosophy, we observe this sensory thought in its development. It reaches here an opposition with the authority of the religion, of the folk religion of the church, etc., and one of the roles of the history of the philosophy is therefore to represent the free thought in its struggle with this authority. But it is not possible that the state of warfare prevailing between the two be the last supreme stage. It is of necessity that the philosophy allow eventually the reconciliation in this struggle. It is of necessity that this be its final goal. But this reconciliation of necessity must ensure that the philosophy, the thinking reason, will find in it satisfaction. Every reconciliation of necessity must be resulting from it. For the needs of the religion and of the philosophy are one, to research the truth. My emphases, A.G. Marx the atheist charges like one who finds great spoil upon that general, absolute, a priori spirit of Hegel, upon the God, and cancels it entirely. The religion is opium for the masses, encountered with contempt, and not with a reference of the ultimate purpose of man and his thought. The a priori spirit of the age, the God according to Hegel, clears its place in Marx for an a priori material existence creating consciousness, and for a claimed deterministic process of human struggle between its productive, exploiting, and exploited aspects, in which the human will, and how much more so the absolute will, is not situated in it entirely. In Marx, the Hegelian dialectic of the objective, external spirit, the spirit of the age, the absolute truth, is replaced by a dialectical material truth of a conscious opposition between a material, natural existence creating thought and between thought creating existence. This opposition, which is material in its essence, is devoid of absolute spirit or God, and its historical significance is a constant struggle of survival over the means of production necessary for man, between those who took control over the means of production in the society, to those serving as means of production for its capitalist rulers. In Marx, it is a matter of a dialectical, material, rational immanence. In the world of nature, out of a claim that the existence creates rational awareness and praxis seeking to change. The reality in a fundamental, a priori dialectical process, coming to expression in the human material world, in the progress from an exploiting material reality to an ideal material reality of social economic equality between the humans. Also, the claim of Marx, who is the material successor of Hegel, constitutes a particular ultimate purpose of the relation between the private domain and the general, and not a relation resulting from within, proven universal assumptions for the purpose of the conclusion of the exemplary essence of the universal objective moral rule, in relation to a specific issue. Hegel and Marx erred in that after the cancellation of the categorical imperative, they acted for the integration between the speculative reason of Kant to his practical moral reason by means of the addition of a certain rational a priori process in the world of the is derived from a priori concepts like the spirit of the age, or from a material existence, and out of the cancellation of the issue of the pure will in general and the subjective in particular. The a priori process of finding the moral imperative turned from a process of moral duty dependent on pure will and execution of a subjective, personal free will, to an a priori theoretical process, disconnected entirely from the issue of the will and the experience together. Instead of checking the relation between the public domain and the individual in a general and specific manner by means of the analysis of the general and specific moral object and subject, in an experimental manner given to refutation, these thinkers sought to determine it as an objective theoretical fact from within an a priori process, without a distinction between what ought to be and what is. The very placing of such an a priori relation, without a difference between the desired and the existing, as a fundamental value or pattern of action from the beginning, and the forced integration between the speculative and moral reason turns that same claimed ideal/material dialectical process to a conclusion of taste whose source is subjective, and not to a fact which is a universal truth, given anyway to constant refutation. This is, in practice, an penetration to the field beyond the recognition, that same field in which there is knowledge regarding the entirety of the existence, which as itself constitutes an absolute free will. A field that is not situated to man, an erroneous mixing between the existing and the desired in the world of the is. In Hegel, there is, in the field in which he walks, necessarily a requiring to the realization of God, and in Marx, to the cancellation of God. This error of Hegel and Marx in this aspect was understood apparently by Nietzsche and Leibowitz, and was formulated in a simple, although lacking manner by Popper. Nietzsche rightly cancelled entirely the categorical imperative, without much detail, but with an erroneous courage, and was required accordingly to the requested rational conclusion, without its correction as itself. This cancellation was done at the same time with the cancellation of the attempts of the design, of the general rule, out of any value-based ultimate purpose, which does not exist without a logical analysis proving it, and which according to the formal Nietzsche is not to be found at all. Moreover, the attempt of Nietzsche to design one rule as a basis ruling over the dome of the human truth was doomed in advance to a total failure from its very definition, also in an empirical manner. According to the formal Nietzsche, after the cancellation of the categorical imperative and the seemingly requested rational death of the God, according to a logical evolution of the foundations of the Enlightenment theory, there is not to be found any morality, and there is not any faith. The only rational driving force is that which is created due to the will to power, and the replacement of the erroneous morality and faith with what is more correct than them after a nihilism of the decadent, false, erroneous views existing in this regard. However, it is noticed immediately and clear to all who examines in a critical manner in this claim that its basis is not in a striving for power, but specifically in a striving which he cancels entirely, the striving for truth. From the theory of Nietzsche itself it arises clearly that the aspiration for nihilism, for the purpose of creating new upon the ruins of the old, for the smashing of all theories of morality, wisdom, and faith, constitutes as itself a search after truth and not after a will to power, which is an intuitive assumption of Nietzsche within the framework of the will to truth. It is enough if we see, as an example and a parable, that the immediate rational price of such a striving one is, as Nietzsche himself describes, an indescribable suffering, at whose end are hidden in a realistic manner not the power, but specifically the failure and the excommunication and the disgrace, unless you see in them an internal power, without relation to a real power achieved toward the other. Nietzsche disqualifies the categorical rule rightly, but following this disqualification, he is required in a manner that is not logical exemplary to the smashing of the past instead of its correction. When the categorical imperative falls, Nietzsche lifts hands in the attempts to find a moral value that is not designed by the ability of the subjective will, as a goal or as an essence, and leads this conclusion of his to extremity within the framework of his perception of the striving to truth, to the design of the future by the subjective superior will of the overman, the will to power. The error of Nietzsche is therefore double, both methodological and pure rational. First, if the categorical imperative is not valid, it is worthy to prove in a systematic manner why, what possibilities are likely to come in its place, and to refute them until we are left with a possibility for which a refutation has not yet been found, although this is possible only by definition. Moreover, the nihilism is erroneous by definition, since, as said, it treasures within it by a definitional manner the past. For behold, the smashing of the past and another view in its place necessarily obligate a connection to the past. As much as the connection to the past is obligated, behold, in a rational manner is obligated a connection given to refutation, and which yet has not been refuted. For if not so, It is a matter of the personal taste of the proposer, and not in anything of value beyond this. The rejection of the material, earthly will to power of Nietzsche as a real rational basis for understanding the essence of man is requested therefore by itself, since without an explanation of the basis of the rational mechanism, it is equivalent to the rejection of the will to truth, as well as to the rejection of the will for ice cream, because it is not possible to refute it or to prove it at all. The rejection of the existence of the morality and the God requires a logical explanation and not a telling of tales in talented rhymes on the paper, be they decisive, extraordinary, and charismatic as they be. In the absence of a logical explanation for this rejection, or in the refutation of the claims of Nietzsche for this rejection, the view of the formal Nietzsche remains as his personal taste, the herald of evil, in a manner similar but opposite to the conclusion of the formal Leibowitz from his necessary refutation of the categorical imperative. This claim stands on the assumption that, beyond the cancellation of the morality and the God, and the nihilism refuted from its essentials, we are not cancelling also the reason itself, as they tried to claim, this way or another, the puzzling successors of Nietzsche, the talented technicians of the great error, as I will explain this here briefly. The refutation of the categorical imperative does not teach on the absence of an objective morality, which is beyond the subjective will. It does not subject man to the overman, etc. On the contrary, it teaches on the need for the discovery of the principles of the universal morality, from within the refutation of the principles that failed. From the very existence of the private domain is derived the existence of the public domain, and in its broad definition, the existence, havaya. Therefore, in a definitional manner, the will to power does not stand at the basis of the thought and action of man, since by definition, it cannot sustain the private domain and the public domain in an optimal manner, in a balanced manner. Not the strong is the survivor, but the balanced. Not the dinosaurs, but the birds and man. Not the way of the edge, not the overman, but the way of the middle, the old and good, the way of the rational human being, scientific, moral, and faithful as one. The attempt to cancel the objective moral dimension of the human existence, as well as the faithful objective dimension, is doomed to failure, for it contradicts the nature of man from its very rational and methodological definition. It is erroneous from the perspective of understanding the essence of the morality as itself, which does not include as itself the issue of the will. And at the same time, the call/cry of the formal Nietzsche teaches on the vital need in its contradiction, in finding something new and true from within the erroneous and false nihilism, from within the erroneous cancellation of the morality, the faith, and the will to truth, which has no end, from the perspective of the man, in the world of the is, by definition, except for the material and necessarily false overman resulting from it, whose end too is known in advance, like the end of all matter, and every theory of matter upon matter as it is. In contrast to Nietzsche, in the formal Leibowitz, indeed there is not to be found a universal morality resulting from the reason of man, but there exists a claimed faith of truth, designed by the action constituting it. The conclusion of Leibowitz, as a result of the refutation of the categorical imperative, is entirely different from that of Nietzsche, but no less problematic. To his taste, there is not to be found at all an objective morality. There is no value that is universal, but every man and man decides in a subjective manner regarding the moral value standing at the basis of his action. And more so, according to the formal Leibowitz, like the decision regarding the moral value, so too regarding the decision regarding the faith, there is no possibility to convince that their foundation is in error, but they are the volitional subjective decision of man. In practice, Leibowitz lifts hands in the rational moral aspect, after the expiration of the categorical imperative, and on the other hand, he seeks the objectification of the faith, including the worthy behavior, by means of a distinct canonization of the halakha, encountering as itself, and with much rational justice, the distinct opposition of Kant in the question of the religion within the limits of the reason. According to the formal claim of Leibowitz, the faith of truth is the acceptance of the yoke of Torah and commandments, according to the subjective volitional decision of man, without a rational explanation for the meaning, pesher, of its truth. This erroneous claim takes necessarily the religion out of the limits of the reason and obligates a rational refutation, correction, or rejection. When Leibowitz declares that he is not a humanist, this matter does not mean at all that, like Nietzsche, he does not advocate for justice, for fairness, for honesty, but that their true source as truth is by no means from man, his reason and his universal values, the rational intellectual internal ones as the opinion of Kant, but from the faith of truth which is universal in its essence. Since this faith as itself cannot be explained, for its foundations are situated beyond the recognition of man, and since the free will as itself also is not given to explanation, since it is situated outside the ability of man, behold, there is no place for an objective rational explanation regarding the value of the truth or the faith of the truth. I worship God in the action, not in the proof of the foundations of the action. The essential claim of both Leibowitz and Kant for the difference between the morality to the science is in practice that the science discusses what is forced upon us, while the morality discusses what we decide shall be done, and therefore it is a matter of entirely different aspects in the thought of man. But while Kant thinks that the morality is learned in an absolute manner from the reason and from it alone, Leibowitz claims that there is not to be found an objective value, but a value being designed from a subjective decision of the will of man, which is, as itself, possessed of dimensions impossible to explain, and separated from the matter of the faith. Moreover, according to the formal Leibowitz, there is not and cannot be from the direction of the faith a recognition of morality revealed in a rational process, from an intellectual source, but only and solely from instructions derived from the commandments in the Torah, whose source is not conscience, nor reason, but divine only. He who perceives man as one of the creatures in the creation, and remembers the "I have set the Lord always before me," cannot accept the morality as a scale and as a touchstone. There are but one of two meanings for morality. A, as a direction of the willing of man in accordance with his recognition of the truth of the reality. This is the morality of Socrates, of Plato, and of Aristotle, of the Epicureans and the Stoics, particularly of these latter ones, in the New Philosophy, of Spinoza. B, as a direction of the willing of man in accordance with his recognition of his duty. This is the morality of Kant and of the German idealism. But in the reading of Shema, it is said, "And you shall not follow after your hearts and after your eyes." You shall not follow after your hearts. This is the negation of Kant. You shall not follow after your eyes. This is the negation of Socrates. And immediately, even the reasoning of these two negations is given. I am the Lord your God. The Torah does not recognize moral imperatives whose source is in the recognition of the natural reality, or in the recognition of the duty of man to man. It recognizes nothing but commandments, mitzvot. The Torah and the prophets never appeal to the human conscience, which is very suspect as an expression of idol worship. The term conscience, matspun, does not exist in the Bible. The conscientious guidance is an atheistic or idolatrous concept. The God in the heart, which humanistic men of morality advocate, is a foreign God. The halakha, as a religious institution, does not suffer the category of morality. And it goes without saying that it does not suffer a utilitarian basing, not from the perspective of the good of the individual, and not from the perspective of the good of the nation, or the society, etc. And thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself is the great rule in the Torah, not because it is an idea and an instruction that is beyond the formalism of the law and that is above the detailing of the commandments, but specifically because it appears as one of 613 commandments. This quote of the formal Leibowitz illustrates to us his methodological and essential error in the analysis of the issue of the connection between the morality and the faith. And all this why? Because methodologically, a citation of a verse from the Torah as itself does not constitute an exemplary proof for a thing and half a thing, and essentially, the command, "And you shall not spy after your heart and after your eyes, I am the Lord your God," including chapter B in Genesis. In its inclusive context, its distinct meaning is specifically, do not go after the senses, but specifically after the thought. Moreover, if in contrast to Nietzsche, Leibowitz reaches a faithful conclusion whose practical significance is that there is no objective humanistic morality to be found. Behold, in practice, this erroneous conclusion leads to the fact that it is not possible to point rationally to a faith of truth. The formal Leibowitz errs, and his continuing error in his practical canonical faith results also from the absence of a systematic analysis of the errors of his predecessors in the connection between the worthy and the eyes and the will. His position is that we must distinguish between the world of the objective science to the world of the morality determined subjectively by our personal decision. However, unfortunately, the rational conclusion, without the correction of the categorical imperative, is specifically the erroneous conclusion of Nietzsche, meaning that we must cancel the old worlds, the moral world, the objective truth, and the God, and to discover something else. The reason for this is because in the absence of an objective morality, there is in practice no morality at all. In the absence of a faith given to the critique of the reason and aspects given to such a critique, one should not accept any faith except as a personal taste and nothing more. But as said, the correct and requested step from a rational perspective in the falling of the categorical imperative is not to lift hands here or there, but specifically to correct the error and to reach a new, old conclusion. Not a lifting of hands of the type of two worlds, and not a lifting of hands of the type of the absence of the two worlds, but a rational correction within the limits of the reason of the categorical imperative of Kant is what is needed to us. We must place to the categorical imperative a systematic, logical, worthy alternative, and this on the assumption that we accept the fundamental principles of the critique of the pure reason, which I assumed in advance at the opening of this chapter. The morality of truth, like the faith of truth, which forever will not be achieved in their fullness, are learned exactly in the same way in which the natural rules are learned, by means of categorical forms and concepts and experience, without connection to the will, which is a factor in the decision of action, according to the value, and not in the objective discovery of the value as itself. This is a correction needed to the bases of the categorical imperative, as well as to the common error mixing between what is existing to what is worthy to be, out of an absence of a worthy understanding of the issue of the will. The reason for this is because in the absence of an objective morality, there is in practice no morality at all. In the absence of a faith given to the critique of the reason and aspects given to such a critique, one should not accept any faith except as a personal taste and nothing more. But as said, the correct and requested step from a rational perspective in the falling of the categorical imperative is not to lift hands here or there, but specifically to correct the error and to reach a new, old conclusion. Not a lifting of hands of the type of two worlds, and not a lifting of hands of the type of the absence of the two worlds, but a rational correction within the limits of the reason of the categorical imperative of Kant is what is needed to us. We must place to the categorical imperative a systematic, logical, worthy alternative, and this on the assumption that we accept the fundamental principles of the critique of the pure reason, which I assumed in advance at the opening of this chapter. The morality of truth, like the faith of truth, which forever will not be achieved in their fullness, are learned exactly in the same way in which the natural rules are learned, by means of categorical forms and concepts and experience, without connection to the will, which is a factor in the decision of action, according to the value, and not in the objective discovery of the value as itself. This is a correction needed to the bases of the categorical imperative, as well as to the common error mixing between what is existing to what is worthy to be, out of an absence of a worthy understanding of the issue of the will.
על ביקורת המוסר הטהור.
First, I will require to the definition of the morality. The morality is the status of man before the essence of the is, Havayat Hayesh. This is an objective status being revealed in an empirical manner upon a rational substrate, a universal status whose essence is an exemplary balance between a private domain, Reshut Yahid, and a public domain, Reshut Harabim, in relation to a discussed case, constituting the worthy moral action for execution within this framework. This status is universal by definition, and it results from the very definition of the two a priori domains, in a manner of requiring to their a priori general dimension, while balancing between them in their a posteriori dimension meaning, in relation to the examined case, which constitutes the universal entirety of the action. This is a balance between the two domains, as an objective, supreme aspiration given to the execution of man by means of his volitional decision. This is a logical derivative of their essence, and their ideal and specific ultimate purpose of the individual's and the public's domain, sustaining both of them together in relation to a specific case. In contrast to the universal moral rule being revealed as a universal rule from the experience of the rational individual, behold the relative free will of the individual regarding the taking of an action toward this balance or not, is his subjective moral decision from his perspective in the matter of his action, according to the universal moral rule learned in an exemplary experimental manner upon a moral substrate, a priori, as will be clarified. First, it will be noted that it can be seen in an immediate manner that the morality as itself is not complete and cannot be complete regarding the worthy action from a logical perspective, due to its necessary ignorance of the undefined essence and its implications in this matter. The morality is in fact a private case of the rational research, and not a different case, when the discovery of the moral value is done in that same rational way in which the discovery of the scientific rule is done, an empirical examination upon an a priori substrate, although more complex. If to use the concepts of Kant, the moral reason includes the theoretical scientific reason, within the framework of a similar thought process of research and proof, although more extensive from the very exemplary definition of the morality, as will be clarified below. This old ancient issue of scientific research of the materials versus the norms troubled the philosophers for a long time, and it seems to me that part of the cancellors of the objective morality erred in the foundations of the objects of their research. Thus, for example, Karl Popper seeks in his known book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, to establish his critique on the pseudo-scientific social theories by means of a clear separation between scientific facts and normative facts which are not existing to his taste. This erroneous distinction of Popper regarding the scientific theories and of the thinkers of the social scientific theories is rooted in the absence of a correct requiring to the correct objects of research, which does not act for the prediction of the behavior of man. The moral laws, to be distinguished from the scientific laws learned by us, are relations between subjects and objects learned by our theoretical intellect by means of experience upon a moral, a priori, rational substrate, to be distinguished from a theoretical, only a priori substrate. The claims of Popper regarding a distinction between laws of science to the objective design of moral norms are an error in the understanding of the substrate of the research and an absence of requiring to the rational basis of the theories of Hegel and Marx, meaning an erroneous correction of the categorical imperative of Kant. We must define in an exemplary manner what are the subjects and the objects toward which we seek to examine a value relation law, without a preliminary position regarding a specific value-based ultimate purpose of the relation and without seeking to predict the actions of the specific man in a specific situation which specifically belongs to the field of the theoretical reason. Prediction of the actions of man is a matter from the scientific theoretical field clearly unattainable except at most in a distant approximation, due to the complexity of the material objects connected to it, which are in practice the most complex known to us, including the issue of the relative free will included in them, whose freeness is misunderstood by definition by man. On the other hand, in order to understand the object of the moral research, we must define in a rational manner what is morality, and to examine if there exist fundamental a priori concepts serving for this research, both of the private domain, both of the public domain, and both of the worthy relation between them. Morality is not a generalization of a volitional feasibility of a practical rule to a general rule, and its rules are not determined in an a priori manner by a pure logical will, which is not situated in our knowledge. The will participates in the design of the morality from the perspective of the effort for its discovery, as in science, and in the decision regarding action according to it, but not in a built-in internal manner for the discovery of the essence of the moral law. Morality also is not an absolute internal derivative of such or another specific material value relation rule, whether ideal or economic, since such is not derived in a pure rational intellectual manner, and therefore it is not given to refutation, and there is not in it any dimension of objectivity, but of a specific value-based taste. Morality is a law regarding what is worthy to do, revealed according to an optimal unification between the private domain and the public domain in accordance with their a priori moral forms and categories, and the specific relation between them, meaning in an experimental suitability to a specific practical object according to its logical ultimate purpose, in relation to the public domain and the private domain, specific public domain and private domain. The need for what is worthy, in this unification between the private domain and the public domain, is a necessity learned in an exemplary, rational manner, a necessity toward which the thinking man aspires in a built-in manner, from his very nature as a thinking man. This is the rational need for the balance between the public domain and the private domain learned from the very definition of the private domain. This is an a priori need to be distinguished from its rules, which is devoid of a subjective ultimate purpose, learned from the definition of the thinking I as itself and its derivatives. This is the status of man, facing the world of the is, facing the nature, and mainly facing the other human beings, learned from the reason of man and from it alone. The definition of the moral value is therefore a rational definition, whose matter is in the objectivity given to refutation of the rational morality, in a process similar to the scientific research, and not in an opposite manner as the claim of Kant. It does not assume a preliminary subjective specific ultimate purpose for the morality, but it obligates the specific discovery of the moral law in an empirical manner upon an a priori substrate, imprinted in us from the very definition of the private and the public domain, and I will clarify below this claim of mine. In the examination of the universal moral rule, we do not research the author's intention, the acting will, but the intention of the written natural, meaning the moral rule disconnected from the private will and constituting a universal unity of the private domain and the public domain, resulting from their definition in an experimental relation to the specific case examined by us. This is not the good of the individual as himself, according to his will, which is a subjective matter not given to objectification, and also not a unification of subjective wills, which also they are not given to a real objective examination. This is the rational and proven practical rule of the individual, combining the rational derivatives of the relation and the ultimate purpose resulting from the very definition of the private domain with the definition of the public domain, everyone, and obligating necessarily a discovery of the most balanced and harmonious way between them, in a moral universal manner, in relation to a specific object-specific event perceived by the senses. It is not a matter here of the good given to infinite definitions and relations, but of a rational good given to relative discovery as part of one truth that forever will not be achieved. This is an objective good, innocent, in the world of the is, olam ha-yesh, correct to Genesis A, the objective divine creation, as a product of the absolute free will in the world of the is, but not an individual subjective good, correct to Genesis C, according to the relative subjective free will. In addition to space and time, there are situated in us from our very nature moral a priori forms, which are the private domain, reshut ha-yahid, and the public domain, reshut ha-rabim. And from here also is obligated a certain relation between them. In parallel to time and space, the moral a priori forms are therefore the private domain and the public domain, and the relation between them. We act as the private domain, and from here also as the domain of the collective of the individuals, and more precisely, the domain of the collective of the natural existence, sustaining a certain constant relation between them, which is not a derivative of the examination of the will, but belongs to the field of the rational recognition as itself. The moral a priori forms are therefore the theoretical a priori forms in addition to the moral a priori forms, which are the private domain, public domain, and the existence of a relation between them required for their existence from their very definition. The moral a priori categories, situated in us from our very nature in the moral context meaning, of the relation between the existence of the private domain with the public domain, are the theoretical categories and also of the private domain, the right to life, resulting from the very recognition in the existence of man as an individual, the right to freedom, resulting from the very recognition in the rational existence of the private domain, the right to social economic equality, resulting from the very recognition in the rational existence of the private domain, the human public domain, and the material public domain together, the right to happiness, material pleasure, and rational meaning, resulting from the very recognition in the being of the private domain, a conscious human rational domain implanted in matter, and therefore acting in a rational manner to the filling of lacks imprinted in it by definition. Of the public domain, the existence of a general, ultimate purpose of the general public domain being examined, defined in a limited manner according to the collection of the categories of all the individuals, and in an inclusive manner according to the entire world of the is that is beyond the private domain. Of the relation between the private domain and the public domain, the existence of a relation balance revealed by means of the examination of the optimal balance point that is between the two domains, existing together and separately necessarily. This relation results from their fundamental opposing essence of the private domain and the public domain, since the public domain in its polar absolute essence contradicts the moral a priori categories of the private domain, and in parallel, the private domain in its absolute essence contradicts the a priori categories of the public domain. The relation sustaining the two domains according to their a priori categories in the purest manner is therefore a relation of pure balance, a relation of a complementary opposition that forever will not be revealed by man in its fullness. The discovery of the universal moral law is done in the following manner. Act according to a practical rule sustaining a balance between the practical specific ultimate purpose of the individual and the collective meaning in relation to the practical event being examined. Upon an a priori substrate of your general a priori ultimate purpose as an individual and the general a priori public ultimate purpose. The moral rule is revealed, therefore, in an experimental manner by means of checking the balanced existence of the specific ultimate purpose upon the general ultimate purpose of the private and public domain together, in relation to the object of the examination meaning, the moral action, the worthy action. As I noted above, the moral law is a modern integration of the theoretical approach of Kant with the fundamental balanced and incomplete teleological approach of Aristotle. This is a synthesis between the approaches of two of the greatest sages of humanity, learning from their errors and waiting, of course, for its perfection by the finding of the errors embedded in it itself. The moral forms and the moral categories are learned from our very being, thinking creatures, and from our very being, and they as themselves, in their basic essence, are not given to any personal subjective moral preference or to a preference from the field of the question of the will. The moral rule is required for discovery from the very fact of our being individuals and collective together, and from the very necessary existence of a relation between our individual essence and the collective essence of the world of the is, Olam Hayesh, and in a more limited manner, ours as human beings. This is an objective existential need of man, and from here results the necessity in it and in its discovery, and also its universal existence. The rational private domain assumes from itself, from its very definition, the human and material public domain, external and internal to it, as one, as Kant determined in practice in the Critique of Pure Reason. From this matter also results the necessary existence of a relation regarding the essence, Havaya, that is beyond the is, which also results in a rational manner, but in this I will touch regarding the critique of the pure faithful reason. Before us, therefore, is a constant and never-ending examination for the worthy relation between the private domain and the public domain of man, within the framework of the world of the is, in the limited sense of the essence of the is. As said, This examination is learned by us in an empirical manner upon an a priori substrate of the Kantian theoretical forms and categories, with the addition of the moral forms and categories from within the examination of the specific ultimate purpose of the two domains in relation to an object of moral research, regarding whose matter we seek the moral rule. The understanding of these rules is not possible in an exhaustive manner forever, and it is more complicated than the understanding of the rules of nature, since it is required for the understanding of the most complicated creation of nature known to us in its individual and collective dimension, and also includes within it the understanding of nature and the understanding of man as its most complex creation known to us as one. This understanding is composed of infinite practical situations that it must give its mind regarding them in a different manner. But in its basis, it sustains a unity of an a priori substrate and an experiment for the discovery of the universal moral law upon it. I will require now to an example for illustration, to the conclusions resulting from it, and I will move to the faithful logical inquiry, broader than the theoretical and the moral inquiry, and including them both together. According to Kant, the non-fulfillment of a promise cannot constitute a universal rule, since it contradicts the very meaning of the promise as a statement coming to fulfill that which was said in it, and from here, that one must fulfill promises from a moral perspective. But we have already shown that the fulfillment of a promise also it cannot constitute a universal rule as itself, since every promise must be examined to the body of the specific case within whose framework it was given. In order to answer the question of the morality of the fulfillment of the promise, one must check what is the specific ultimate purpose of the promise in relation to the individual and to the specific public domain, and to conduct a balance between them upon the a priori substrate of the general private domain and the general public domain in order to discover the moral rule examined in relation to the specific action being examined. In contrast to Kant, we must check the worthy action in the worthy relation to the specific promise, not from its general logical context as a promise, but from its specific ultimate purpose, both in relation to the public domain and both in relation to the specific private domain as the giver of the promise. My natural rights as an individual, the natural rights of the public domain, and in a more limited manner, of the many individuals, and the point of balance between the two domains in relation to the specific issue. It is noticed on its face that it is a matter of an inquiry which is simple conceptually, but complicated in a practical manner, different from the natural will of Kant to simplify the things into a simple but erroneous equation. Therefore, the universal moral rule is designed many times by means of what is seen as moral intuition, which is in practice, in the paths of the truth, a perception of the moral object upon a moral a priori substrate and its processing into a moral law. We discover what is worthy, what is moral, from the perspective of the balance required in an experimental manner upon our moral a priori substrate, from a sense of justice, from a moral sense. But this is only part of the process of the moral inquiry and not its end. The continuation of the process is the checking of the standing of the proposed law in a theoretical rational refutation, including the theoretical and the moral categories together. Due to the complexity of the moral research, many were those who thought that this feeling, which is part of the process and not all of it, is a subjective matter, that justice is a relative matter, that there is no universal morality. But as I have already noted above, the fact of a research subject being most complicated does not turn it into subjective, but into difficult to achieve, and this is, of course, a very great difference. That same intuitive claim for a moral rule in a matter of the fulfillment of a promise, for example, we can refute by the model that I presented, and return and refute until we reach a universal moral rule in approximation, but never in a perfect manner. The logical ultimate purpose of a promise, from the perspective of the specific public domain, is an obligation that must be fulfilled, but it is possible that the logical ultimate purpose of the specific promise is not to fulfill it, for example, in a case of a war ruse, etc. The logical ultimate purpose of a promise, from the perspective of the specific private domain, is an obligation for the purpose of receiving a certain thing, or not for such a purpose. but it is possible that the specific ultimate purpose of a promise is a presentation of an obligation, for example, of a bank clerk in relation to a bank robber. Therefore, we must check the specific ultimate purpose of the promise in relation to the private domain and the public domain together, and not its pure logical ultimate purpose in relation to its linguistic meaning. The moral a priori category of the private domain is the right to life, freedom, and equality of the individual, in addition to the theoretical a priori categories. The moral a priori category of the public domain, in its human sense, is the individual rights of the collective of the human beings, in addition to the theoretical a priori categories. Now, we must check upon the a priori substrate above whether the fulfillment of the specific promise stands in opposition to the range of balance between the specific public and private domain to the general logical public and private domain meaning, their a priori categories. Within the framework of this checking, we must examine the measure of the injury of the fulfillment or non-fulfillment of the promise to the a priori categories of the private domain and the measure of the injury to the a priori categories of the public domain. It can be claimed that the fulfillment of the promise, causing, for example, to the cancellation of one of the individual categories, is not moral, and this to be distinguished from an injury to them. But also, this matter is not sufficient, since it is possible a situation in which the fulfillment of the promise cancelling one of the categorical individual rights acts for the existence of that same right at the many, such as, "It is good to die for our country," or a soldier's jump on a grenade thrown in a tent for the purpose of saving his friends, and every going to war that has with it in advance a readiness for the sacrifice of life for the sake of the collective. Or, above this, according to Leibowitz, the overcoming of man over his material drive. From here, that indeed the examination of the universal moral rule in relation to a specific matter must be done from within the examination of the middle point, the specific and general balance together of the two domains, a matter that cannot reach a real full exhaustion by the recognition of man due to its complexity, whether it is a matter of the limited public domain and how much more so the inclusive one. Behold, therefore, if the fulfillment of the promise in its specific ultimate purpose meaning in relation to the individual and the collective, as one, constitutes an injury to one of the categorical individual rights, one must examine whether this injury is situated in the range of balance between the categorical individual right to the identical categorical public right, in its limited sense, to the categorical rights of the collective of the individuals. The range of balance, and how much more so the point of balance, in relation to a specific object of moral examination, are concepts whose understanding is not simple, but their meaning is that the fulfillment of the promise must be from a moral perspective, within the framework of the specific ultimate purpose of the public and private domain, and at the same time to sustain the balance between the a priori fundamental rights of the private domain to the a priori fundamental rights of the public domain. From here results that the supreme, highest, ideal morality is necessarily the action in every specific case which will not injure at all the private domain and the public domain, the general and the specific together, and not the logical a priori rule as the claim of Kant. A striving for this morality is embodied by the way in the expression, "And thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself," whose practical translation to a practical rule is difficult and in practice impossible. And this without being required now to its continuation meaning, "I am the Lord," to which I will require in the continuation of this chapter. Since such a rule of action, learned in an experimental manner, can be known to us only by definition and cannot be achieved by our intellect, behold in practice a practical supreme moral action is the action which will approach the perfect balance between the public domain and the private domain. A balance which of course is not known to us in practice, due to its composition and its complexity. From here results that a practical action or value, canceling or injuring in a fatal manner, the balance between the a priori private domain and the public domain are not moral. From here also results that the claim of the formal Leibowitz, according to which a race theory, or the deification of the Caesar, are moral values that it is not possible to decide between their morality to the morality of the values of Eleanor Roosevelt or the values of the free democracy, is a claim refuted by itself, whose source is in the absence of correction and requiring to the correction of the categorical imperative of Kant. The clear reason for this is that the theories of tyranny of various kinds deviate in a significant manner from the balance between the rights of the individual to the rights of the collective, which is necessary from a moral objective perspective, since they in their essence contradict the moral categories both of the private domain and both of the public domain, while the values of the free democracy approach by definition to this range of balance. From here also results that a human action or mechanism which will act to maximize the balance between the private domain to the public domain in a manner that does not decide between them in advance, but is designed and designs it in approximation by a rational process, are a moral action or mechanism of the first degree. As said, the morality is not an imperative learned in a logical, conceptual, internal manner, but this is a universal rule that must be discovered again and again in that same rational way, as a law of nature must be discovered, in suitability to the moral a priori forms and categories. This is a rule being revealed in an infinite manner, according to specific situations being examined, and it deals with the status of man facing the world of the matter, the nature, and mainly facing the other human beings. This is an objectification of the supreme harmony required for the existence of the private domain and the public domain together, within the framework of the essence of the is, havayat ha-yesh. The categorical imperative is refuted therefore from itself, but the practical conclusion of the formal Leibowitz, according to which, in the absence of a categorical imperative, there is not to be found a moral truth, is erroneous from its foundation, and it results in practice from the absence of an analysis of the type of logical refutation against the analysis of Kant. The moral truth is not different in its essence from the scientific truth, as I opened this composition, but in the difficulty to understand it. Like the scientific truth, it is given to constant discovery and refutation, and like the scientific truth, it is forever unachievable, in a full and absolute manner. The rules of morality are learned from within an empirical perception of that which surrounds us in the private domain and in the public domain, in the essence of the is, upon a substrate of the moral concepts and categories situated in us in a built-in and natural manner, out of a striving for a balance which is, by definition, a complementary opposition between the private domain and the public domain, which is the status of man before the essence of the is.
על ביקורת האמונה הטהורה, או הדרך האמונית, לוגית, לדת האוניברסלית.
The faith in its worthy, true dimension is the status of man before the undefined God, who is the essence, havaya, beyond the essence of the is, havayat hayesh, which necessarily is not identical to it and even includes it by definition. This is the worthy action for man in its complete dimension, including the theoretical and the moral dimension, a complete dimension that forever will not be achieved. Therefore, it will not be surprising that the formal Leibowitz objected to humanistic moral views as a value-based point of departure, and at the same time left this objection and its meaning, from an essential perspective, to a faithful logical explanation. The relative free will is part of the awareness of man, which causes from the perspective of man to strive for the discovery of the truth, to research the laws, to refute them, to discover those more correct than them, and to act or not to act according to them within the framework of his status, toward the other human beings, toward the world of the matter that is outside of him and that is within him. From the sensory perspective of man, this will is free in an absolute manner, and in this illusion of his, accepted by Kant, he errs to think that it is possible to define it, for example, by means of the categorical imperative. From the sensory perspective of the man, this will is free in an absolute manner, and in this illusion of his, accepted by Kant, he errs to think that it is possible to define it, for example, by means of the categorical imperative. But in practice, the free will is free in a relative manner from the perspective of the rational man, and in practice, It is part of the absolute free will of the undefined God, as I noted above. The will is part of the yesh, but its freeness in its absolute essence is not given to definition. On the other hand, the relative free will is given to definition, in contrast to the position of the formal Leibowitz, as it is part of the world of the is, as part of the awareness of man, as the faculty of desire or aversion. But the will of man has no matter whatsoever in determining the worthy status of man toward the world of the is, but in his decision regarding the action determining his status in practice. However, the inquiry of the true meaning of the morality and its constant discovery in the aspect of the worthy custom, to which I required above, is not exhausted in the relation between the materials, as part of the theoretical reason, and also not in the relation between the human beings to the world of the is resulting from the practical reason. As a complete manner, this inquiry includes both the perception of the senses upon an a priori substrate toward the materials, both their perception regarding the status of man toward the world of the is, and both the worthy relation of the human beings toward the entirety of the essence, havaya, including their relation to what is beyond the world of the is, meaning the status of man in relation to the undefined God. The status of man toward the essence, including by definition his relation to the undefined, projects, therefore, by definition, also regarding the matter of his status toward the other human beings, toward the world of the is. According to the essential Leibowitz, there is not and cannot be an inquiry of morality in the paths of the truth without an inquiry of the relation toward the essence, since the worthy relation toward the world of the is included in the worthy relation toward what is beyond the is, including the is and distinguished from it, from the perspective of the is, as one. In contrast to the erroneous position of Kant, distinguishing in an artificial manner between the theoretical reason, which does not contradict in his view the God, but does not obligate his existence, to the practical reason obligating the existence of the freedom, the immortality, and the God, behold, the very existence of the God becomes clear to us in an a priori rational manner, within the framework of a process similar to the process of determining the theoretical and practical forms together. Just as we diagnose a priori forms and categories regarding the inquiry of the nature and the morality, so we must discover what are the forms and categories suitable for the inquiry of the faith, as far as such exist, and I claim that indeed such exist. From the very inquiry of the a priori substrate of Kant, result forms and categories for the inquiry of nature. I showed that there exist forms and categories for the inquiry of morality, in a manner resulting from the a priori rational nature of man, but from the rational research result necessarily also a priori forms and categories regarding the discovery of the logical faith. My thought obligates me to distinguish between the private domain and the public domain, and to find the worthy relation between them from their very essence. And it obligates me also to distinguish between the reality given to the inquiry of the reason, and between what is beyond it, toward which the reason strives and forever will not reach. Accordingly, the space exists, and also what is beyond it, which is undefined, by definition. The time exists, and also what is beyond it, which is undefined, by definition. So also regarding the categories. For all the categories from the field of quantity, there exist undefined categories from the field that is beyond the material quantity, which is beyond the unity, the plurality, the totality, and the modes which are beyond the is, yesh, and the recognition, and necessarily include the aspects of the is. For every category from the field of relation in the world of the is, there exists an undefined category from the field of relation that is beyond the is and the relation, that is between what is beyond the is to the is, what is beyond cause and effect, what is beyond substance and accident, and beyond the reciprocal influence between the active and the passive. So also regarding the quality, regarding what is beyond the quality of the is, which is beyond the reality, the negation, and the limitation, and so of course regarding the matter of the modes. To what is beyond possibility and impossibility, to the existence of the is and the absence of the is, which to my taste is an erroneous concept, to the necessity and the contingency, which to my taste is an erroneous categorical concept, but as said, I am not required to the analysis of the theoretical categories of Kant. Similarly to this, we must observe the moral categories regarding what is beyond the world of the being. Insofar as there exists a right to freedom for the private domain and for the public domain, and there exists a relation between them, so there exists necessarily an absolute freedom to the unity beyond the world of the Is, Olam HaYesh, including the world of the Is, and sustaining an absolute free will, which is not given to definition. Insofar as there exists a right to equality for the rational individual and the collective, so there exists necessarily an absolute equality in the unity beyond the world of the Is, including the world of the Is. Insofar as there exists a right to existence to life for the individual and the collective in the world of the Is, resulting from the very existence of man, so there is sustained necessarily, in an absolute and eternal manner, the divine entity beyond the world of the Is, including the world of the Is, which is necessarily eternal and infinite, and not given to definition. Insofar as there exists the right to happiness as pleasure and as meaning for the individual and the collective in the world of the Is, resulting from within the natural lack, so there is sustained necessarily the eternal happiness, good, in an absolute manner, in the divine entity beyond the world of the Is, resulting from the absence of the lack in an absolute manner, by definition. The reason sketches its boundaries, the boundaries of the world situated in its achievement, and which every inquiry regarding what is beyond it is necessarily an error. According to the formal Leibowitz, the God is undefined, a matter common also to the essential Leibowitz, and the free will is not defined. Accordingly, every subject of the acceptance of the faith is undefined. I decide regarding the acceptance of the yoke of Torah and commandments as a Torah of truth, without any ability to convince in a logical manner on what and why from a rational perspective. Every attempt of persuasion is required necessarily to the field that is not given to our recognition, and every step in this field is necessarily corporeality, gashmiut. I determine that this approach is erroneous. Insofar as the reason sketches its boundaries, behold, it is clear that its boundaries as themselves exist. Insofar as the reason accepts the existence of the undefined and its boundaries facing it, behold, necessarily, it accepts the existence of a relation with it from the very definition of the boundaries facing it. Insofar as the reason sketches its boundaries, behold, necessarily, there exists in it the aspiration for the undefined, which forever will not be achieved, and, on the other hand, according to the theoretical reason, it has already been proven that there exists a constant aspiration of the man for the undefined. It has already been proven that there exists a constant aspiration of man for the undefined. Insofar as the reason recognizes the cause and the effect, behold, necessarily, there is in it an aspiration for what is beyond them, an aspiration that forever will not be achieved. That same aspiration, that same research, that same free thought in a world of individual, collective, and one undefined, that same worship striving for that same supreme rational relation toward the absolute free will which forever will not be achieved, is the faithful logic. And all this why? Because it necessarily contains the theoretical reason, the moral reason, and the faithful reason, which is a necessity of the existence from the very definition of the critique of pure reason, the critique of pure morality, and the critique of pure faith. Because it strives in its essence for the truth which it itself determines in a rational manner that forever will not be achieved. The moment I recognize the existence of a transcendent field that I have no part and inheritance in it itself, behold, I necessarily recognize the relation with it. Insofar as I recognize the necessary and constant sketching of the rational boundaries facing it, I recognize it and the truth which it represents and which we aspire to understand and will never understand. The error of Kant in this aspect, which brought him to a synthetic and forced argument of the obligation of the existence of the God from within the erroneous categorical imperative, is the regular error of requiring to the God by means of requiring to his essence, here the pure will, while is, from a rational perspective, can be required only to the God's trail, shovalo, situated in the world of the is, and not to what is beyond the recognition. There are those who claim that even if we agree to the matter of the existence of a field that is beyond our recognition, behold, it does not result from this necessarily the matter of the existence of the undefined God, but their error is placed at their doorstep. God is not an invention dependent on the utility of man. His existence is imprinted in man in an exemplary a priori manner. From the very being of man, a rational creature possessed of awareness, to the reality of the is and its boundaries. The existence of the undefined God is learned in an a priori rational manner from his trail, Shovalo, in the reality of the is. From the derivatives of his trail are revealed also the faithful logical categories upon which the faith is revealed in the paths of the truth, in a constant and never-ending experimental manner. The undefined God is not identical to the reality of the is nature, and he, and perhaps more precisely his trail, is revealed and learned in a research negating corporeal attributes, negation of attributes, as Maimonides already noted in a preliminary manner. In an advanced manner, it can be said that from the undefined essence of the undefined God, whose very existence is imprinted exemplarily, a priori in the rational man, results the unattainable striving toward him being carried out in an exemplary experimental manner upon the faithful logical categories revealed from his trail in the world of the is. The undefined God necessarily created the reality of the is, its objects and its laws. He necessarily preceded it in an eternal manner that is not understood to us and cannot be understood to us by definition. He necessarily includes within him, in an eternal manner, a reality that is not understood to us and cannot be understood to us. He necessarily sustains within him absolute and eternal freedom, free will, absolute and eternal unity, equality, and absolute and eternal happiness, good, that cannot be understood to us due to our being part of the world of the is. There are those who claim the paradox of the omnipotent against the existence of the God, but their error is situated in the matter of the embodiment, gashmut, of the God, and the requiring to his essence, and not to the God's trail, shovalo, learned solely by means of the rational reason in an exemplary manner, in which the essence of the God is embedded and imprinted in it in a built-in manner. The reason is required for the scientific research of the aspects of the matter in the world of the is, olam hayesh, for the research of the status of the rational is facing the world of the is, and in the status of man in relation to God, from within the research of God's trail, revealed in the world of the is, but never for the research of what is beyond the recognition, and how much more so not regarding the matter of his embodiment. The paradox of the omnipotent is therefore a failing attempt for the use of corporeal tools for the research of what is beyond the recognition, and as such, it is necessarily a deviation from the boundaries of the reason, and therefore there is in it no substance. Now we must seek to define what is the religion of truth as an object for a rational inquiry. What is the religion striving for the truth that forever will not be achieved? Or in other words, what is the faithful logical religion? The faithful logical religion is the worthy relation between man to the undefined, which is learned in a rational manner, or, in other words, the status of man before the God. This relation is more extensive in its true essence than the morality, which is the worthy relation between man to the world of the matter, including the collective of the human beings. The faithful logic is necessarily superior to the science and the morality because it includes them and is more general than them. This is the ultimate purpose of man, learned from within the theoretical reason, the recognition of the status of man before the undefined God. The most difficult inquiry and worthy action of all, the supreme ascent from the matter to the spirit, in the ladder of the inclusive truth. This is the faith for its own sake, lishma, which is the most difficult to achieve, and to the understanding of man from its very nature, which is for its own sake, lishma, because necessarily it is not dependent on any corporeal thing, just as the absolute truth exists and is not dependent on any corporeal thing, including a utilitarian thing. The categorical fundamental forms for the purpose of this examination are the forms of the theoretical and the moral reason with the addition of the existence of the undefined, or in other words, the existence of the God. The error of Kant in this aspect is a built-in error in the philosophical development. walking in the paths of the truth. The philosopher does not discuss that which he is not capable of discussing, whether due to the circumstances of his life, the society in which he lived, its pressures and constraints, the philosophical development until his time, etc. At the same time, the philosopher of truth always leaves an opening for the correction that will come after him, which is expressed by means of an error in the basis of the things, which sometimes is so prominent until it is almost invisible. The very acceptance of the existence of the transcendent obligates a built-in, systematic, careful, rational discussion, devoid of influences in relation toward it, to be distinguished from a discussion of it itself, which is impossible. This is the aspiration of the reason for the undefined, which is defeated time after time at the boundaries being designed by this rational and material aspiration. From this very understanding result all the forms and all the categories for this matter, which are all the rational and moral forms and categories, with the addition of the faithful logical forms and categories, the faithful logical categorical forms, all the theoretical and moral categorical forms, and also the existence of the one and only God, the undefined. The faithful logical categories, all the theoretical and moral categories, and also the undefined God necessarily preceded the world of the is, Olam HaYesh, and also of course the forms, the categories, and the objects of the theoretical and moral reason, which are necessarily corporeal. The undefined God necessarily created the objects of the theoretical and moral reason, and the relation between the materials. The undefined God necessarily includes the reality of the is, and what is beyond it, and is not identical to it, and from here also the objects of the theoretical and moral reason, and the relation between the materials in an undefined manner, and not identical to them as one. The undefined God necessarily is not given to division or to plurality. His unity and his uniqueness result from the very absence of his corporeality and his being beyond the defined world of the is. The matter and the relation between the materials, objects of the theoretical and moral reason, cannot be different in their foundation from their material source, from the moment of the creation of the is by the undefined God, except in their complexity. The matter upon its parts and its components necessarily aspires from its very nature to return to the moment of its creation by the undefined God, and in its conscious aspects of the matter, to the undefined God himself. In the undefined God are sustained necessarily also absolute freedom, free will, absolute unity, equality, and absolute happiness, good, toward which the matter upon its rational aspects aspires, and toward which and toward him it forever will not reach. The faithful logical rule is therefore, act in the paths of the truth for its own sake, lishma, revealed from a faithful logical research in the essence of the is, in the aspects of the science, the morality, and the trail, shovalo, of the undefined God, learned according to a theoretical research, a moral research, and also according to acclaimed divine revelation, according to its exemplary interpretation upon a faithful logical a priori substrate, including the theoretical and the practical reason together, and not contradicting them by definition. From the perspective of Leibowitz, the status of man before God is at the ultimate purpose of man, unachievable by definition. In this, he is correct from a faithful logical perspective, but the rational infrastructure of this claim of his and its formal conclusions are erroneous. The reason for this is because for the purpose of the objectification of the religion, he mixes between the action and practice to what is worthy that be done. When the Torah teaches us that in the standing of Mount Sinai which failed, according to the formal Leibowitz, the people declared that, "We will do and we will hear, Naaseh v'nishma." He does not recognize that this is a preliminary declaration to a higher declaration of, "We will think and we will do, Nakshov v'naaseh," and so on. When the Torah uses the language of miracles, according to Leibowitz, these are not miracles in practice. God did not descend upon Mount Sinai, for behold, such a descent means corporeality contradicting the imperative and rational meaning of the undefined God. I am that I am, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. And at the same time, the formal Leibowitz is not capable of pointing to the simple truth according to which the miracles appear in the Torah, always in the context of the beginning of the halakha, in the way of the faith or in the context of the sinning pagans and such like. The miracle of the flood, or Sodom and Gomorrah, versus the absence of any real miracle in the faith of Abraham, and how much more so of his successors until the book of Exodus, in which the greatest of them was apparently punished due to the sin of the miracle. The miracle of the burning bush of the beginning of the faith of Moses, the miracle of the 10 plagues facing Pharaoh and the Egyptians, the miracle of the parting of the sea between Pharaoh and his army, to Moses and the people in its poverty, emerging from the paganism and the slavery, the miracle of the manna, the miracle of the descent of the God upon the mountain, and afterwards. There are no real miracles, and in any case, there is no importance to their actual examination, meaning whether they occurred in practice or not, but only what is their allegorical meaning, which must be proven in a rational, exemplary manner, as distinguished from their meaning according to their literal sense, pashat. Not for nothing, there exists a severe and symbolic punishment on the striking on the rock, which also is a symbolic material miracle, which is not suitable for one whose faith is situated in a stage so advanced as the faith of Moses, as distinguished from the faith of the people. This is the way between we will do and we will hear to we will think and we will do. The formal Leibowitz is not capable of explaining why not to go in the way of Spinoza and to observe that which is written according to the homiletic sense, darash, and not according to that which is written by way of the literal sense, pashat. He is not capable of pointing to the inclusive picture, since he is not required to its foundations, how much more so in a systematic manner. Like all the real philosophers, he can only break the way beyond the world in which he is implanted to the paths of the world of the truth situated in the promised land, which forever will not be achieved. To that same land, good or not good in matter, but always required correction in spirit, viewed necessarily from the mountain of the prophecy. There are, in the faithful position of Leibowitz, not a few parallels to the religion within the limits of the reason alone of Kant, but he does not have, as also to Kant, any convincing explanation why their position is situated within the framework of the truth, or within the framework of the paths of the truth. The faith, in its non-rational design, leads to false imaginations, to deviations from the way of the truth, to an erroneous thought from its foundation, and also to unworthy actions beside them. Upon this stood in an incidental manner Aristotle, and in an explicit manner Maimonides and Kant. Upon this stands in a distinct manner the exemplary reason. The faith in its logical sense leads to a constant discovery of the status of man toward God, which is the most difficult among the other inquiries, being occupied also with the unachievable by definition. The error in the view of the formal Leibowitz results among other things from its basis meaning, from the separation of the faith and the morality from the apparently objective, from the science. The formal conclusions of Leibowitz, similarly to Kant, treasure within them the solution, after the correction of the errors of the basis, placed at their foundation. Like Kant, Leibowitz claims that the true faith is situated here and now. This is not the original Torah according to his view, but the oral Torah. Both of them claim, Leibowitz at the end of his days, that the true faith is learned by each and every one of us in a rational manner alone, and is situated in an essential manner here and now. Like Kant, Leibowitz fails in the basis of his faithful argument, and approaches the requested conclusion of the faithful logical argument out of an absence of a possibility to disconnect from his specific faith, from the tradition constituting the framework of his earthly life in his time. When Leibowitz claims that the religion of truth is the acceptance of the yoke of Torah and commandments, he is right and errs at the same time. When Kant claims that the Christianity is a religion striving for universality, and as such, it constitutes the main basis for the religion within the limits of the reason, he is right and errs at the same time, and I will explain below briefly my words. Both Leibowitz and Kant fall in a different but similar manner to the so-human error of the distinction between a rational logical world to a faithful logical world. This error includes within it the difference between the absolute free will, which forever will not be achieved, to the relative free will, striving for the absolute free will, which is its foundation and its source, and which forever will not be achieved by it. From the perspective of the basis of the things, to be distinguished from Kant, one must not subject the kingdom of God upon earth to the categorical imperative, and to be distinguished from Leibowitz, one must not separate between the science, the morality, and the religion from a rational perspective. On the contrary, the religion is part of the process of the theoretical thinking, and results in its true dimension necessarily from a research regarding the boundaries of the reason, and its recognition in the absence of ability for the recognition of the God, who is that beyond them. The foundations of the method of Kant, both in the level of the practical reason, in his attempt to establish an objectification of the morality, and both in the field of the religion, in his attempt to establish in an objective manner the religion of God upon earth, are erroneous foundations. At the same time, they, and also the concluding result of his method regarding the existence of one true religion, constitute a fascinating and moving step forward, requiring a faithful logical correction toward the way of the paths of the truth. The trap that Kant set for himself in the categorical imperative does not allow him to settle the contradiction between the action of the theoretical reason to the action of the moral reason in the context of the faith, and by this dooms his logical possibility to require to the religion within the limits of the reason alone. The faith exists in man in a built-in manner, and it is learned from the very existence of an undefined and unachievable field, learned by the reason and the necessity of the existence of a relation, learned in a rational manner alone between the undefined field to the field of the is, yesh. This relation bears a primary rational mode of a boundary, of a striving toward what is beyond the boundary, of a striving for the understanding of the relation between the two sides of the boundary, and the action of the relative free will, striving toward the absolute free will, as well as the known in advance failure of these strivings. The striving for the discovery of the entirety of the laws in the essence, Havaya, within the framework of the world of the is, including the laws of nature, the morality, the laws of the relation between man to God, and the striving of the relative free will toward the absolute free will, or in other words, to the action according to the entirety of the laws of the essence, is it the faithful logical worship of God. This is, if so, by definition, the faith for its own sake, lishma, a faith that is not dependent on anything from the world of the is, including matter, utility, or need, but in the understanding of the laws of the divine essence in the world of the is, and in the action according to them. From this perspective, the holy scriptures of the various monotheistic faiths constitute part of the world of the is, and they must be examined in a faithful logical manner, and this without any importance to the question of their source, the human or the divine. And while a reservation according to which from a rational perspective, the source of the striving for the status of man before God is the absolute free divine will. As I noted above, the worship of the one God in the paths of the truth is part of the absolute free will. This is the relation appearing in our eyes as a relation between us to the undefined God, while from a faithful logical perspective, this is the relation between the undefined God to man. The importance of the Holy Scriptures is situated in their claim for a divine revelation, and their striving for the worship of the one God, since it is a product of the absolute free will, as far as it concerns the products of the truth in it, revealed by means of the faithful logic. This integration characterizing as itself, and by definition, the mode of the basic discovery of the religion of truth, obligates now also an interpretation of truth. From the very necessary definition of the religion of truth is revealed also the faithful logical interpretation, extracting in an integration of together and separately with the divine revelation, the laws of the faithful logical essence. This is the thought action revealing the laws of the relation in the world of the is between man to the undefined God, being renewed and changing by means of the reason in an exemplary manner of rational refutation and so forth. This is the religion walking in the paths of the truth. Since the relation with the undefined is so complex and so simple as one behold, that it is revealed necessarily in a rational manner in what is seen by man as a divine revelation. At the same time, since it is built in that we are dealing, in the true dimension of the things, with a theoretical action including the science, in the sense of logical thought, the morality, in its logical sense, and the relation to the undefined from the perspective of the God's trail, shavalo, behold necessarily is obligated toward the claimed divine revelation, a faithful logical interpretation. This interpretation is obligated to the extraction of the universal dimensions of the claimed revelation, and at the same time acts for the examination of their truth, and this in the dimension of the relation of man toward God. In this matter, both Kant and Leibowitz are correct when they both determine decisively that the true religion is the current halakha, and it must be revealed by each and every one of us, in a rational manner given to refutation. At the same time, regarding the matter of their formal position, behold in an understandable manner, the error in their formal views is situated upon the face of the things. From the perspective of Kant, the claim that the Christianity is the only universal religion is a clear error, since the reality is learned by man, according to Kant, by means of experience upon an a priori substrate, and not the opposite. A primary object of faithful reality to which the Christian religion is required, and seeks to find from within it universal rules from a faithful perspective, is the book of the Torah, and the ignorance of Kant of this central matter teaches also it on the faithful logical need in its clear correction. The reality as itself is not brought to our doorstep as laws, and also not as laws learned by mere observation in the reality. According to Jesus, the founder of the Christianity, one must not detract even a letter and even a jot, yud, from the Torah, similar to the saying of the Prophet Muhammad, who views the Quran as a translation of the book of the Torah to the pagan Arab world that preceded the acceptance of the Islam. And more so, the Christian religion in its universal essence is in the aspect of a striving for an interpretation of the book of the Torah with the rational tools of that period, as was understood later by Luther, and so also the religion of Islam, as was understood earlier, in a wonderful but primary manner, by Avicenna, and even more brilliant and advanced than him, by Averroes, who conceived in the period of Maimonides and even was born in the city of birth of Maimonides, Cordoba. In this context, by the way, one should not wonder regarding the brilliant position of Moses Mendelssohn, according to which he accepts the principles of morality of the Christianity, but not its religious claims. The claim for prophecy as a faithful logical divine revelation from this perspective does not contradict at all the essence of the experience upon an a priori substrate, but sharpens it and allows us to advance by means of a faithful logical requiring to its bases and its conclusions. Also, the requiring of the New Testament to the prophecy of Isaiah, who is among the greatest of the later and excellent prophets among them, does not contradict this at all, and even intensifies the need of the faithful logical correction, since he too, in practice, is an interpreter of the book of the Torah, calling for the Torah which shall go forth from Zion in the end of days, with all its implications from a faithful logical perspective. The Torah from Zion mentioned in the words of Isaiah, and the New Covenant, New Testament, mentioned in the words of Jeremiah, are among the classical prophetic calls for the discovery of the necessarily universal Torah, the faithful logical Torah by definition. I would summarize this chapter in the following manner. The conclusions of the theoretical reason are revealed by means of the scientific research through the perception of the matter by the senses, upon a theoretical a priori substrate. The conclusions of the moral reason are revealed by means of determining the worthy balanced relation between the private and the public domain through sensory perception of the moral objects upon a moral a priori substrate. Due to the complexity of the process and its objects, it can be said that the moral law is revealed by means of a thought process that I would term moral intuition. This is a process similar in its essence to the process of scientific research, but different from the perspective of man reaching its peak in a manner appearing to man as moral intuition due to its complexity. Like the scientific research, the truth of the moral law revealed from moral intuition is examined by means of an empirical checking upon the moral a priori substrate, in the manner of refutation. The determinations of the formal Leibowitz regarding subjective morality, and regarding the absence of a possibility to determine what is a moral value and what is an immoral value, are completely refuted determinations. There is no difficulty in identifying values which distinctly do not sustain the harmony and the balance between the a priori and specific private and public domains, even if the way to this discovery is, from the perspective of man, moral intuition. The supreme difficulty is revealed mainly in the discovery of the moral rules that are within the range of balance and the harmony between the domains, as distinguished from its poles. Thus, all the race theories, fascism, and to be distinguished, the worship of money and land as a value, the elevation of the means, necessarily material, to the status of a goal beyond the importance of man as an individual, tyranny of all kinds. All these are clearly immoral theories because they are prominently opposed to the balance required between the private domain and the public domain, which is the worthy rational relation between them. They cancel, by definition, the harmony required between the a priori private domain and the a priori public domain, in the name of such or another value, which is necessarily subjective. In contrast, free democracy as itself is a social democratic mechanism at whose basis morality stands, because in its fundamental, definitional essence, it constitutes an aspiration for balance between the individual and the collective domain in their general a priori and specific a posteriori sense. Every mechanism coming to perfect and sustain the free democracy toward a direction of balance between the private and the public domain is a moral mechanism, and vice versa. Every mechanism and every trend coming to distance the free democracy from the point of balance between the individual and the collective are less moral in such or another degree, by definition. From here I move to the faith of truth. The faith of truth must strive for the truth for its own sake, lishma. The faith of truth is the status of man before the undefined God, and it is expressed by means of sensory perception of the objects of faith, meaning the reality in the world of the is, olam hayesh, including the objects of the theoretical, moral, and faithful research, the God's trail, shovalo, and examines them without contradiction upon a faithful logical a priori substrate, including the theoretical and moral a priori forms and categories, as well as the faithful logical ones specified above, and reveals from them the faithful logical rule. The basic process of the discovery of the faith for its own sake in the undefined God is a much more complicated process than the scientific and moral research, because it includes them and adds the search for the worthy custom, in an exemplary manner, in relation to the undefined God. Therefore, the basis of this process, from the perspective of man, is the divine revelation, which is in its essence identical to the scientific and moral processes, but superior to them and constitutes the peak of the thinking man. Due to its supreme complexity, the thought approach to the palace appears as a divine revelation in the eyes of man, and from here also the so human tendency to mix it with false imaginations, mysticism, miracles, predicting the future and more, which turn even the potential prophecy of truth into a false prophecy. The truth of the divine revelation as a prophecy of truth, as a faithful logical revelation, meaning as a thought, theoretical, moral, and faithful peak together, regarding its conceptual, current, and practical meaning, is revealed by means of a faithful logical process identical in its essence to the scientific and moral process, and including it also in this sense that it does not contradict its objective conclusions. The faith of truth is forever a process of faithful logical interpretation, conceptual and practical as one, of the divine revelation, which requires constant refutation. This is the worship of God for its own sake, lishma, by means of the difficult and constant ascent in the stages of the ladder of truth toward the undefined God, toward action according to the understanding of His laws, His commandments, and His judgments in the world of the ease, which forever will not be revealed in their fullness.